Welcome back to SpookySpeaks. I'm your host, and tonight we'll be delving into another chilling tale. Turn off the lights, draw the curtains, and prepare yourself for the horrors about to unfold. But remember, never watch alone, for darkness always harbors frightening secrets. Are you ready? Let's begin. The suspicious roadkill. The endless Montana highway stretched before me, a ribbon of darkness cutting through the vast, empty landscape. My truck's headlights carved a meager path through the oppressive night, the beams seeming to disappear into an abyss of nothingness just beyond its reach. I'd been on the road for hours, the monotony of the journey broken only by the occasional static-laced country song on the radio and the rhythmic thrum of tires on asphalt. It was supposed to be a routine haul, just another long-distance delivery for the trucking company I'd been with for the past 5 years. But as the miles ticked by on my odometer, a gnawing unease began to settle in my gut. Something wasn't right. I glanced at my fuel gauge, the needle hovering dangerously close to empty. Panic rose in my throat as I realized my company had grossly miscalculated my mileage. With a trembling hand, I reached for my company-issued phone and sent out an urgent request for an emergency fuel-up. The response came back quickly, but it did little to quell my anxiety. The nearest approved gas station was miles off my planned route, down a series of winding back roads that snaked through some of the most desolate parts of the state. I had no choice. With a resigned sigh, I turned off the main highway, the darkness seeming to deepen as I left the relative safety of the well-traveled road behind. As I drove, the world outside my cab seemed to close in around me. There was no moon tonight, its comforting glow obscured by a thick blanket of clouds. The usual tapestry of stars that adorned the Montana sky was absent, leaving nothing but an inky void above. The darkness was total, absolute, broken only by the cone of light from my high beams. I hadn't seen another vehicle in over an hour. The isolation was palpable, a heavy weight pressing down on me from all sides. In that moment, I felt like the last person on Earth, adrift in a sea of shadows. The minutes stretched into what felt like hours as I navigated the unfamiliar roads. My eyes strained in the darkness, searching for any landmark or sign that might indicate I was on the right path. But there was nothing, just an endless procession of trees and rocky outcroppings, their shapes distorted into monstrous silhouettes by my headlights. It was then that I saw it. A dark mass in the middle of the road, barely visible at the furthest extent of my headlights. My heart rate spiked as I eased off the accelerator, the truck's speed dropping as I approached the unidentified object. As I drew closer, details began to emerge from the darkness. At first, I thought it might be a fallen branch or perhaps some debris blown onto the road by the wind. But as the distance closed, a chill ran down my spine. This was no inanimate object. I was mere feet away when recognition hit me like a physical blow. My foot slammed on the brake pedal, the truck's tires screaming in protest as I skidded to a halt. The cab lurched forward, and I gripped the steering wheel with white-knuckled hands, my breath coming in short, panicked gasps. For a long moment, I sat there, my mind reeling as it tried to process what I'd just seen. It couldn't be real. It had to be a trick of the light, a hallucination, born from too many hours on the road and not enough sleep. But deep down, I knew what I'd seen was all too real. With trembling hands, I shifted the truck into reverse, my eyes glued to the rearview mirror. Slowly, agonizingly, I backed up until the red glow of my brake lights illuminated the grotesque form lying in the middle of the road. I don't know what compelled me to get out of the truck. Maybe it was morbid curiosity, or perhaps some deeply ingrained sense of duty. Whatever the reason, I found myself reaching for my jacket and flashlight, my hand shaking as I pulled open the cab door. The night air hit me like a physical force as I stepped out onto the asphalt. It was bitterly cold, the kind of chill that seeps into your bones and lingers for hours. The silence was oppressive, broken only by the low rumble of my idling engine and the crunch of gravel under my boots as I made my way to the rear of the trailer. With each step, a voice in the back of my mind screamed at me to turn back, to climb into the safety of my cab and drive away as fast as I could. But I couldn't. I had to know. My hand shook as I raised the flashlight, its beam cutting through the darkness to illuminate the thing on the road. In that moment, I felt the world tilt on its axis, reality warping around me as I struggled to comprehend what I was seeing. There, in the harsh glare of my flashlight, lay a corpse unlike anything I'd ever seen before. It was as if someone, or something, had peeled away the outer layers, leaving behind a ghastly anatomical display. The ribcage stood out in stark relief, each bone clearly visible without the concealment of skin or muscle. Attached to it was a jumble of other bones, held together by glistening ligaments that seemed to pulse in the flickering light. But it was the absence that struck me most profoundly. There was no head, no face to identify the poor soul who had met such a gruesome end. No fur or hide to suggest it was an animal. No shred of clothing to indicate it had once been human. I stood there, rooted to the spot, my mind reeling as it tried to make sense of the nightmarish scene before me. The air around me seemed to grow thicker, charged with an energy I couldn't explain. Steam rose from the mangled remains, curling into grotesque shapes that danced at the edge of my vision. As the initial shock began to wear off, questions flooded my mind. What could have done this? Was it human, an animal, something else entirely? The ribcage seemed large enough to have belonged to a person, but the utter lack of identifying features made it impossible to be sure. My first instinct was to call the police. Whatever had happened here, it wasn't natural. But when I pulled out my phone, my heart sank. No service. Of course. I was miles from the nearest town, cut off from any hope of assistance. It was then that I heard it, a soft sound at the edge of my hearing, barely audible over the idling engine of my truck. I swung my flashlight around, its beam cutting through the darkness to illuminate the edge of the road. My blood ran cold. There, at the periphery of the light, stood a group of coyotes. Their eyes glowed an eerie yellow in the reflected light, fixed upon me with an intensity that sent shivers down my spine. For a moment, we stood frozen in a silent tableau. Me, the unfortunate victim on the road, and these wild observers. Then, as if responding to some unheard signal, the coyotes began to move. They slipped through gaps in the fence line, their movements fluid and purposeful as they trotted in my direction. There was something unnatural about their approach, a coordinated precision that spoke of intelligence beyond mere animal instinct. Panic surged through me, breaking the paralysis that had held me in place. I backpedaled towards my truck, my eyes never leaving the advancing pack. Questions raced through my mind. Were they responsible for the corpse? Had I interrupted their meal? Or were they drawn by some other, more sinister purpose? I reached the cab of my truck just as the first coyote stepped onto the asphalt. Without a backwards glance, I hauled myself inside, slamming the door shut behind me. My hands shook as I put the truck in gear, the engine roaring to life as I accelerated away from the macabre scene. As I drove, my mind raced, trying to make sense of what I'd witnessed. The rational part of my brain argued that it must have been a deer, struck by another truck at high speed. The damage from such an impact could certainly be severe. But even as I clung to this explanation, doubts nagged at me. In all my years on the road, I'd never seen roadkill so completely stripped of its outer layers, so meticulously dismantled. The miles slipped by as I pushed on towards the gas station, my knuckles white on the steering wheel. Every shadow on the road seemed to hold potential threats. Every rustle in the underbrush along the roadside made me flinch. The coyotes haunted my rearview mirror, their glowing eyes seeming to follow me long after they'd disappeared from view. When I finally reached the gas station, it was like emerging from a nightmare into the harsh light of day. The fluorescent glare of the pumps was almost painful after so many hours in darkness, but I welcomed it. As I filled my tank, I found myself scanning the shadows beyond the station's lights, half expecting to see those eerie yellow eyes watching me. The remainder of my journey passed in a blur of paranoia and exhaustion. Every bump in the road, every unexpected sound sent my heart racing. By the time I reached my destination and completed my delivery, I was a wreck, jumping at shadows and flinching at every unexpected movement. In the days and weeks that followed, I tried to put the incident behind me. I told myself it was just an animal, nothing more. But in the quiet moments, when sleep eluded me and the memory of that night came flooding back, I couldn't shake the feeling that I'd brushed up against something beyond my understanding. To this day, I don't know what I saw on that lonely Montana highway. Was it truly just an unfortunate deer, as I've tried to convince myself? Or was it something more sinister? A glimpse into a world of horrors that exists just beyond the reach of our headlights. One thing I know for certain, I'll never forget the sight of that mangled corpse, stripped bare and abandoned in the middle of nowhere. And sometimes, in my darkest moments, I swear I can still see those coyote eyes watching me, waiting for me to let my guard down. The road holds many secrets, and some of them are better left undiscovered. But once you've seen behind the veil, there's no going back. The darkness is always there, just beyond the light, waiting to swallow you whole. The shoulder walkers. The endless ribbon of asphalt stretched before me, a black serpent winding its way through the darkness. My headlights carved a path through the night, illuminating the faded yellow lines that seemed to disappear into infinity. I'm Jack Harlow, 42 years old, and I've been driving trucks for over 2 decades. My regular route takes me from Vancouver to San Francisco, a journey I've made more times than I can count. Most truckers prefer the daylight hours, when the world is alive and the roads are bustling with activity. But not me. I've always favored the night, when the highways are empty and the only company I keep is the hum of my engine and the occasional crackling of the CB radio. There's a peacefulness to it, a solitude that I've come to cherish over the years. But with that solitude comes other things. Things that don't show themselves in the light of day. Things that lurk in the shadows, waiting for unsuspecting travelers to pass by. I've seen my fair share of oddities on these late-night hauls. UFOs hovering silently over distant hills, their lights pulsing with an otherworldly glow. Shadows that move with too much purpose to be mere animals, leaving me to wonder if the legends of Bigfoot might hold more truth than most would believe. But none of these sightings ever truly frightened me. They were curiosities, sure, but nothing that kept me up at night. No, the real terror came from something far more mundane at first glance. People walking along the shoulder of the road, miles from anywhere. I remember the first time I saw one. It was on my very first solo run down Interstate 5, that long stretch of highway that connects the Pacific Northwest to California. The moon was full that night, casting an eerie silver glow over the landscape. I'd been driving for hours, my eyes growing heavy with fatigue, when I saw her. A woman in a pale blue summer dress, strolling along the shoulder of the road, as casually as if she were taking a Sunday walk in the park. Her bare feet kicked up small puffs of dust with each step, visible in the glow of my headlights. We were miles from any town, any sign of civilization. The nearest exit was at least an hour in either direction. As I approached, I expected her to turn, to wave, to ask for help, but she didn't even acknowledge my presence. She just kept walking, her eyes fixed on some distant point, a vacant smile playing on her lips. I slowed down, my trucker's instinct to help warring with an inexplicable sense of unease. In the end, I kept driving, watching her shrink in my rearview mirror until she disappeared into the night. I tried to rationalize it. Maybe she was a hippie from some nearby campsite, high on whatever they were passing around the fire. Maybe she was a hitchhiker who'd had a falling out with her ride. But deep down, I knew these explanations rang hollow. There was something off about her. Something that didn't belong in this world. After that night, I started noticing them more and more. Not every trip, mind you, but often enough to set my nerves on edge. Always at night, always on the most isolated stretches of road. Men, women, young, old, all shapes and sizes. But they all had one thing in common. That eerie, detached demeanor, as if they were sleepwalking through a world only they could see. The other truckers have a name for them, moon wanderers. But I prefer to call them shoulder walkers. It's more fitting, I think. They never stray from that thin white line, like trains on an invisible track. Always walking, never stopping, never looking up. For years I did my best to ignore them. I'd see one in the distance, illuminated for a brief moment in my headlights, and then they'd be gone, swallowed up by the darkness behind me. I told myself they were just a strange quirk of the road, nothing to worry about. But deep down, a part of me knew better. There was something sinister about these nocturnal wanderers, something that set my teeth on edge. It was about 6 months ago when everything changed. I was making my usual run, the cab of my truck filled with the low hum of the engine and the occasional crackle of the CB radio. The night was particularly dark, the moon hidden behind a thick blanket of clouds. My headlights seemed to be swallowed up by the inky blackness, barely illuminating the road ahead. That's when I saw her. An old woman, hunched and frail, shuffling along the shoulder. She was dressed in a thin hospital gown that fluttered in the breeze, her feet clad in those flimsy slippers they give you in medical facilities. Her white hair was a wild tangle around her head, and even from a distance, I could see how pale and sickly she looked. Something about her struck a chord in me. Maybe it was the way she reminded me of my own grandmother in her final days. Maybe it was just the sheer wrongness of seeing someone so vulnerable out here in the middle of nowhere. Whatever the reason, I found myself slowing down, guiding my rig onto the shoulder. I sat there for a moment, my hand on the door handle, wrestling with my conscience. Every instinct I'd developed over years on the road was screaming at me to keep driving. But I couldn't shake the image of my own grandmother, confused and alone, wandering down some God-forsaken highway in the dead of night. With a heavy sigh, I grabbed my flashlight from the glove box and stepped out into the cool night air. The silence was oppressive, broken only by the tick-tick-tick of my cooling engine and a faint, rhythmic sound in the distance. Scrape, scrape, scrape. The old woman's slippers on the rough asphalt. I switched on my flashlight, its beam cutting through the darkness. "Hello?" I called out, my voice sounding unnaturally loud in the stillness. "Ma'am, are you all right?" No response. Just that steady scraping sound, growing louder as she approached. I swallowed hard, fighting down a surge of panic. This was wrong. Everything about this situation was wrong. I pulled out my phone, checking the map. The nearest town was over 50 miles away. There was no way this frail old woman had walked from there, and no way she was planning to walk there. So where had she come from? Where was she going? The scraping was louder now, almost upon me. I raised my flashlight, my hand shaking slightly, and then she entered the beam of light. Up close, she was even more unsettling. Her skin was pale, almost translucent, stretched tight over her bones. Her eyes were sunken, two dark pits in her gaunt face. But it was her smile that truly chilled me to the bone. It was wide, too wide, stretching from ear to ear in a rictus of joy that never reached her dead eyes. "Ma'am?" I managed to choke out. "Are you okay? Do you need help?" She didn't respond, she just kept walking, that horrible smile fixed on her face. As she drew closer, her arms began to rise, fingers stretching out towards me like gnarled branches reaching for the sun. I stumbled backward, my legs suddenly weak. "Stay back," I warned, but my voice came out as little more than a whisper. She was upon me now, her cold, bony fingers wrapping around my ankles with surprising strength. Before I could react, I was on the ground, being dragged along the shoulder. The rough asphalt tore at my clothes, scraping my skin raw. Panic surged through me. I kicked out wildly, my foot connecting with her jaw. It was like kicking solid stone, the impact jarring me to my core, but miraculously, she let go. I scrambled backward, my heart pounding in my chest. The old woman stood there for a moment, that terrifying smile never wavering. Then, as if nothing had happened, she resumed her steady shuffle down the highway. I don't know how long I sat there, trembling and gasping for breath. It could have been minutes or hours. Eventually, I managed to pull myself together enough to stagger back to my truck. As I climbed into the cab, I caught sight of her in my side mirror, still walking, still smiling. I gunned the engine, eager to put as much distance between us as possible. But as I sped down the highway, I soon caught up with her again. And as I passed, her head swiveled to follow me, that horrible smile still plastered on her face. Her eyes, once vacant, were now filled with a terrible hunger. Since that night, I've spoken to other truckers about the shoulder walkers. Most laugh it off, chalking it up to road fatigue or an overactive imagination. But a few get real quiet. They don't want to talk about it, but the fear in their eyes tells me all I need to know. I'm not the only one who's seen them. I still make my Vancouver to San Francisco run. I still drive at night. But now, every shadow on the roadside makes me flinch. Every lone figure in the distance sends a chill down my spine. And the shoulder walkers, they're still out there. Only now, they all turn to look at me as I pass. Men, women, even children, all with that same terrible smile. It's as if that encounter with the old woman marked me somehow, made me visible to whatever dark force drives these nightmarish wanderers. I've thought about quitting, about finding a nice day job where I never have to see another highway at night. But something keeps me on the road. Maybe it's stubbornness. Maybe it's the hope that one day I'll find an explanation for what I've seen. Or maybe it's the fear of what might happen if I stop moving, if I give the shoulder walkers a chance to catch up with me. So I keep driving, night after night, mile after mile, and I pray. I pray that my story reaches others, that it saves some poor soul from making the same mistake I did. If you're driving late at night and you see someone walking along the shoulder, don't stop. Don't slow down. Just keep driving, and whatever you do, don't look back. Because out there in the darkness, on the lonely stretches of highway where the civilized world fades away, the shoulder walkers are waiting. And once they've seen you, they never forget. They never stop. They just keep walking, one step at a time, always moving forward, always smiling that terrible smile. And someday, somehow, they'll find you. The fog. The rhythmic hum of tires on asphalt had long since faded into white noise as I guided my Costco truck down the lonely stretch of Interstate 265. The clock on my dashboard glowed an eerie 3 a.m., its red digits a stark contrast to the inky darkness beyond my windshield. I was Tom Reeves, 38 years old, seasoned truck driver, and right now the only soul for miles on this God-forsaken Kentucky highway. It was that time of year again, the holiday season, when Costco's toy shipments became as frenzied as Santa's workshop. I'd been with the company for over a decade, known for my speed and reliability. So when the call came in for an urgent restock of giant Spider-Man dolls at our rural Kentucky location, I was the go-to guy. "Tom," my supervisor had said, his voice tinny over the phone, "we need you on this one. Nobody else can make it in time." I'd agreed, of course. That's what I did. I delivered, no matter the hour, no matter the weather. Loading up my truck with boxes upon boxes of web-slinging action figures, I'd set out into the night, the open road stretching endlessly before me. Now, hours into my journey, an unsettling feeling began to creep over me. It started as a slight unease, a prickling at the back of my neck. I tried to shake it off, attributing it to the late hour and the copious amounts of coffee I'd consumed. But as the miles ticked by, the feeling only intensified. Reaching into my jacket pocket, I pulled out a bottle of No-Dawes. The rattling of the pills inside seemed unnaturally loud in the quiet cab. I dry swallowed a couple, hoping the caffeine would sharpen my senses and dispel the growing dread that seemed to be closing in around me. 15 minutes later, I noticed the first wisps of fog curling across the road. It started innocuously enough, thin tendrils creeping across the asphalt, easily dispersed by my truck's headlights. But with each passing minute, the fog thickened, growing denser and more oppressive. I'd driven through fog before. It was part and parcel of life on the road, but this was different. This fog seemed to have a life of its own, swirling and coalescing in ways that defied natural explanation. It pressed against my windshield, reducing visibility to mere feet in front of my truck. My knuckles whitened on the steering wheel as I leaned forward, straining to see through the supernatural murk. The lines on the road disappeared, swallowed by the creeping white tendrils. It was like driving through a cloud, a disorienting blanket of white that seemed to absorb all sound and light. Finally, admitting defeat, I carefully guided my truck to the shoulder of the road. The tires crunched on gravel as I came to a stop. The fog so thick now that I couldn't even see the hood of my own vehicle. I put the truck in park and killed the engine, leaving only the parking lights on to conserve battery. Silence descended, broken only by my own ragged breathing. I glanced at my watch. 3:20 a.m. I was ahead of schedule, I reasoned. Surely I could afford to wait until the fog lifted a bit. After all, there were no other vehicles on the road. I was alone out here, or so I thought. 5 minutes passed in eerie silence. The fog pressed against the windows, an impenetrable white wall that seemed to be closing in around me. I reached for the radio, hoping to dispel the unsettling quiet with some late-night talk show or country music. But as I turned the dial, nothing came through but static, harsh and grating in the stillness of the night. Suddenly, without warning, my truck went dead. The parking lights blinked out, plunging me into total darkness. The steady hum of the engine, which had become such a constant companion on my long drives, fell silent. Panic began to rise in my throat as I frantically turned the key in the ignition. Nothing. Not even a click. My heart pounding, I reached for my CB radio. "Breaker, breaker," I called out, my voice sounding strained even to my own ears. "This is Costco 117. I'm stranded on I-265. Anyone copy? Only static answered me, a harsh hiss that seemed to mock my growing fear. With trembling hands, I pulled out my cell phone. No signal. Of course. Why would anything work out here in the middle of nowhere? As the reality of my situation began to sink in, a new sound penetrated the fog-muffled silence. At first, it was so faint, I thought I might be imagining it. A soft, plaintive cry that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. I held my breath, straining to hear. There it was again, the unmistakable sound of a child crying. My blood ran cold. What was a child doing out here in the middle of the night in this impenetrable fog? I'm a big man, 6'3", and 250 pounds of solid muscle from years of loading and unloading trucks. I've faced down my fair share of tough situations on the road, but in that moment, sitting in my powerless truck surrounded by unnatural fog, I felt smaller and more vulnerable than I ever had in my life. The crying continued, growing louder and more distinct. As I listened, frozen in place, the sound began to change. The high-pitched sobs of a child slowly morphed, deepening and taking on a different timbre. Now it sounded like a woman crying, heart-wrenching sobs that seemed to echo through the fog. Every instinct I had screamed at me to stay put, to lock the doors and wait for dawn. But a lifetime of helping others warred with my fear. What if someone really was in trouble out there? With a trembling hand, I reached for the window crank. The glass lowered with a soft whir, allowing tendrils of fog to creep into the cab. My voice shook as I called out, "Hello? Is anybody out there? Do you need help?" The crying stopped abruptly, cut off as if someone had flipped a switch. The silence that followed was deafening, pressing against my eardrums like a physical force. For a long moment, nothing moved, nothing breathed. Then, from somewhere in the impenetrable white beyond my truck, came a laugh. It started low, barely audible, a chuckle that might have been mistaken for the wind if I hadn't been straining to hear. But it grew quickly, rising in volume and intensity until it echoed all around me. This was no joyful sound. The laughter was cruel, mocking, filled with a malevolence that sent shivers down my spine, and I knew with a certainty that chilled me to my very core that it was directed at me. Panic overwhelmed me. I frantically cranked the window closed, my fingers fumbling with the handle in my haste. But even through the glass, the laughter continued, growing louder and more maniacal with each passing second. I pressed my hands over my ears, trying to block out the sound, but it was useless. The laughter seemed to be inside my head now, reverberating through my skull. I could feel myself starting to hyperventilate, my breath coming in short, sharp gasps as terror threatened to overwhelm me. And then, as suddenly as it had begun, it stopped. The laughter cut off mid-cackle, leaving behind a silence so profound it was almost painful. In that same instant, my truck roared to life, the dashboard lights flickering on and the engine purring as if nothing had ever been wrong. I blinked, momentarily blinded by the sudden illumination. As my eyes adjusted, I realized that the fog was dissipating, fading away as quickly and mysteriously as it had appeared. Within moments, the road ahead was clear, the yellow lines stark against the black asphalt. For a long moment, I sat there, my hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly my knuckles had turned white. My mind raced, trying to make sense of what had just happened. Had I imagined it all? Was it some kind of waking nightmare brought on by exhaustion and too much caffeine? But the fear that still coursed through my veins was all too real. Whatever had happened out there in the fog, whatever had laughed at me with such cruel delight, it had left its mark. With shaking hands, I put the truck in gear and pressed down on the accelerator. The engine roared as I sped away from that stretch of highway, my eyes constantly darting to the rearview mirror, half expecting to see something emerging from the dissipating fog behind me. I didn't slow down until I reached the next truck stop, some 50 miles down the road. As soon as I pulled in, I practically fell out of the cab in my haste to get to the bathroom. The harsh fluorescent lights and the smell of cheap coffee and grease that permeated the air had never been so welcome. I stumbled to the sink, turning on the tap and splashing cold water on my face. As I looked up at my reflection in the grimy mirror, I barely recognized the man staring back at me. My face was pale, my eyes wide and haunted. Did that really just happen? I whispered to my reflection, water dripping from my chin. The rational part of my brain tried to explain it away, a combination of fatigue, caffeine, and an overactive imagination. But deep down, I knew better. Whatever I had encountered on that foggy stretch of I-265, it wasn't something that could be explained away by logic or reason. As I made my way back to my truck, my legs still unsteady, I couldn't shake the feeling that something had changed. The world seemed different now, as if a veil had been lifted, revealing glimpses of things that existed just beyond the edge of our perception. I completed my delivery that night, unloading those giant Spider-Man dolls with mechanical precision. But as I drove back home, I found myself avoiding I-265, taking a longer route that added hours to my journey. I told myself it was just to avoid potential fog, but I knew the truth. I was afraid of what might be waiting for me in the mist, laughing that cruel laugh and crying those heart-wrenching sobs. To this day, I can't drive through fog without breaking out in a cold sweat. Every time I see those tendrils of white creeping across the road, I remember that night, the oppressive silence, the crying that morphed from child to woman, and that laugh, that terrible, mocking laugh that seemed to come from the depths of hell itself. I've never told anyone else about what happened that night. Who would believe me? But sometimes on long nights when sleep eludes me, I find myself staring out the window, watching for any sign of unnatural fog. And in those moments, I swear I can hear the faintest echo of that laugh, carried on the wind, a reminder that there are things in this world that defy explanation, things that lurk in the spaces between what we know and what we fear to discover. The next time you're driving down a lonely road and fog starts to roll in, remember my story. And whatever you do, don't stop. Don't roll down your windows. And most importantly, don't answer if you hear someone crying. Because you never know what might be waiting out there in the fog, ready to laugh at your fear and drag you into the unknown.